guest tonight is Andrew Lang, who is not of the generation that I represent and most of these great historians represent. But I had a long conversation with him a couple of months ago or so. Just we hadn't met, so we were just getting acquainted. And he said that he was concerned that this tradition may not be carrying on as much as we would like it to be. And I don't know enough about it to really. I'm sure he's right, or I mean, he's got good reasons for what he says. But I do know that he's an exception, if that is the truth, because he's been making great contributions. His books receive the highest awards that you can get in the Civil War field, and there's so much interest in that field. There's a lot written, so to get awards like that is a very impressive thing. He's got his doctorate in history from Rice University, and he teaches at Mississippi State University, and we're very glad to have him here, Andrew Lang.
Okay, good evening. So this is my first trip to UCLA, my second trip to Los Angeles proper, my first trip being just driving through. And so it is an absolute thrill and honor to be here. Thank you to Professor Lowenstein, the staff of CLAFI, the student club. This is truly a great opportunity for me. So when Professor Lowenstein invited me several months ago to lecture this evening, I didn't quite put together in my mind that tonight's event is taking place 2 days after the election. And speaking on gratitude for the American political system, and you can put it all together in your mind. I'm hoping tonight, though, that we can step back from all the angst, the fraught, the emotion, and think about how somebody in our nation's past also dealt with a fraught political moment, certainly far more concentrated than our own. And that person, of course, is Mr. Lincoln, whom I'm currently writing on for my next book project. I felt that 16,000 books on Abraham Lincoln is not enough. We need one more to round out our understanding of that great, complex American. So Americans live in an overwhelming age, or an age, I should say, of overwhelming abundance and acute fracture. We enjoy degrees of political liberty, material opulence, and civil equality never experienced in human history. And yet we are riddled with political despair. Demagogues scorn civic virtue and democratic norms. Polls reveal a collapse of confidence in political and social institutions. Meanwhile, popular culture, parts of academia, pundits, celebrities, seem routinely to sneer at the Western liberal tradition. Indeed, a alleged relic of a bygone age, the American founding now reeks of oppression, offering little to those who inhabit a diverse modern society. Tonight I want to offer a controversial proposition. Part, certainly not all, but part of our national angst, to me, derives from a sense of ingratitude for the American Union, the constitutional order, and the founding itself. Now, to be sure, I am in no way suggesting that we need to be complacent or passive amid very real political dysfunction and social ills. But I think that we can take solace in knowing that our moment is hardly unique. Abraham Lincoln inhabited a similar era of discord. Lincoln, of course, is known for many things, but perhaps the trait that most infused his public and private lives was his sense of gratitude. A keen appreciation for the American Republic inspired his politics. Gratitude clarified Lincoln's purpose as he navigated the barbed thickets of sectional discord and the bloody fields of civil war. Even in the bleakest of moments, Lincoln's gratitude reminds us that our national character depends on simple humility. Will we permit the noblest champion of American democracy to summon our gratitude? Lincoln cannot solve our political dysfunction. He can, however, perhaps, teach us the necessity of thankfulness in a fraught political age. And so tonight, I want to explore three themes that navigate Lincoln's political thought pertaining to gratitude. The first is coming to terms with the concept and meaning of what the American Union was, what it meant to the mid-19th century, to the generation that waged the U.S. Civil War. Then we'll turn to how Lincoln himself understood the virtue and trait of gratitude, framed briefly within the context of some of his leading contemporaries. And then third, I want to trace a narrative of American life that Lincoln put forward in his public writings and speeches as he tried to explain what Americans were going through in the 1850s and 60s, particularly insofar as he understood his own moment as the consequence of national ingratitude. It's a story that he told himself and his people about the sectional crisis and Civil War. So turning to the first, on the American Union. 85 years after the Republic's birth, on July 4th, 1861, the United States stood on the precipice of collapse. 11 slaveholding states had recently pronounced their secession from the Union, and they now waged war on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The stakes could not be higher when Lincoln addressed Congress in special session on July 4th. This is essentially a people's contest. On the side of the Union, it is a struggle for maintaining in the world that substance of government whose leading object is to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, to clear the paths of laudable pursuit for all, to afford all an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life. Thus how Lincoln defined the secession crisis. In other words, to lose the Union was to lose the world's best hope for individual liberty and government of, by, and for the people. To preserve the Union was thus to uphold the Father's sacred work. Indeed, as a natural rights republic, the American Union stood alone amid a global plain of noble monarchies and exploitative oligarchies. The first nation ever to center the standard of individual human dignity at its apex, the United States pledged as its signal obligation the protection and propagation of individual rights to life and liberty. It was a lofty ideal, but it was an ideal nonetheless that held that ordinary people were not consigned to be helpless wards of the state. A free citizenry rather possessed a natural right to liberty, to chart sovereign lives, self-ownership, and economic mobility. For Lincoln, the American founding fostered what he called the promise of something better for all people, a sacred commitment that he believed, quote, has secured our free government and consequent prosperity. Now, if the democracy that protected these ideals collapsed, then all who cherished individual autonomy would be deprived what Lincoln said, an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life. Ultimately, the Declaration of Independence infused the American Union with a life-giving, quote, principle of liberty to all, the principle that clears the path for all, gives hope to all, and by consequence, an enterprise, industry to all. How does the Union work? How is it intended to work? Then and now, the American Union adheres a remarkably diverse polity. The constitutional order hosts an ingenious space for diverse factions to debate, forge political compromise, and achieve some kind of consensus without resorting to revolutionary swings in power. The American regime presupposes the principle of unity, essential for good government. And here I take a line from the political scientist Yuval Levin, who said that unity does not mean thinking alike. Unity means acting together. And I think that that's worth reflecting on. Unity encourages not conformity, but argument, debate, dissent. compelling political majorities to temper themselves, and constitutional deference to political minorities. Indeed, the Constitution provides avenues for gradual social and political change without bending society to the fleeting radicalism of factional lust. And here, by 1861, the American Union confronted what Lincoln would later call a fiery trial, which will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. If slaveholding secessionists succeeded in severing an egalitarian republic in the name of chattel slavery, then they would signal that the Father's work was not self-evident, that the natural rights doctrine of the Declaration and the ordered liberty of the Constitution were not universal, that there could exist an alternate American nation, one rooted in oppression, slavery, and hierarchy exclusively. By 1861, at least for the president, an errant people had to repent. They had to recommit, to the blessing of liberty. They had to renew their gratitude for the founding. Otherwise, the American Union might well perish from the earth. So turning to our second theme then, how Lincoln understood this ancient virtue of gratitude. Now, if you go to the collected works of Abraham Lincoln online and do a keyword search for gratitude, the word appears 74 times in the 8 volumes of the collected works of Abraham Lincoln. But one citation stands out above most others. Long before the secession crisis of 1861, as a younger man in 1838 at the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln asked how to perpetuate the nation's free political institutions. His prescription? Quote, gratitude to our fathers. Fathers who had once had such faith in their progeny that they authored, quote, before an admiring world an otherwise fantastical proposition, namely the capability of a people to govern themselves. As the world's most democratic society during the early 19th century, the American Republic boasted what Lincoln called political institutions, conducing more essentially to the ends of civil and religious liberty than any of which the history of former times tells us. The rule of law, the sanctity of the individual, had erected, quote, a political edifice of liberty. For a 29-year-old Lincoln, a free people were duty-bound to transmit their undeserved inheritance out of, quote, justice to ourselves, duty to posterity, and love for our species. But by the 1830s, when the young Lincoln was working through these ideas, he populated a citizenry drunk on their own selfishness, distended by their own national abundance. And in his mind, his fellow citizens had sullied their enviable bequest. Citizens had displayed what he called an increasing disregard for law, succumbing to the wild and furious passions of mob justice. It was an age of democratic splendor, and yet the citizenry paraded with boorish impiety, thinking little about the sacrifices or conviction of their fathers. They ignored their good fortune. They renounced themselves as what Lincoln called the active agents in the advancement of the noblest cause, that of establishing and maintaining civil and religious liberty. It was an age of chaos. Lincoln warned that social mayhem bred decay. Decay triggered anxiety. Anxiety fed pleas for someone, anyone, to cure the madness. Lincoln envisioned a strong man from the old world, whom he called the towering genius, rising, suspending the law, erecting a dictatorship, and reigning with impunity. In that scenario, the Republic of Liberty he imagined might simmer to ash, its flames never reignited by the spark of an ungrateful people. And so by 1838, Americans confronted a singular choice. Either profess gratitude for the wisdom of their fathers, or reject their faith entirely and wither into oblivion. To prevent such catastrophe, Lincoln beseeched all free citizens to reaffirm, quote, the political religion of the nation and evoke reverence for the Constitution and the law. What then is gratitude? Cicero called gratitude not only the greatest of virtues, but the parent of all others. Gratitude expresses earnest appreciation for undeserved kindness and benefits, for the daily blessings of life itself. Gratitude does not extol fleeting material riches. It encourages contemplation of one's good fortune in pursuing the well-lived life. Gratitude abhors complacency and loathes vanity. It recognizes the antecedent universe and its moral compass. Gratitude demands more of ourselves, for we all here are products of those who believed in us, who bathed us in inestimable faith. Our purpose is thus not ours alone. Gratitude fosters individual and collective peace. It binds the social compact, and it fosters purposeful agency in a hostile world of grueling toil. As he came of age, Lincoln enjoyed reading dictionaries, as we all do. He particularly liked Noah Webster's 1783 American Spelling Book, and as a young child, Lincoln may well have read and contemplated how Noah Webster defined gratitude, which Webster says was a trait that, quote, fits a man to be a better citizen, who is sensible of favors and ready to acknowledge them, and is more inclined to perform kind offices not only toward his benefactors, but toward all others. In other words, gratitude is a sacred attribute of civil society, a reciprocal obligation of liberty, a vital precept of justice, and a basic submission to objective truth. Now, on the flip side, ingratitude does not convey mere ambivalence. Gratitude populates the foulest of the vices. It permits the aimless to satisfy their venal passions, unmoved at the consequences of their exploits. Lincoln read about these exploits. He was an avid reader of the Bible. He may well have encountered those stories from the Old Testament in which the Israelites ignored God's beneficence, only to find that divine wrath ensued. Ingratitude appears in the New Testament as spiritual decay, a conviction of those who abjured the gift of everlasting life. An agent of deceit, ingratitude waged and perhaps still wages an eternal war in a house divided between the righteous and the faithless. So observed the Apostle Paul, even with God's wondrous miracles before their eyes, skeptics glorified him not as God. Neither were they thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their heart, their foolish heart, was darkened. In other words, existing with amoral purpose, the soul perished from the earth. As a young boy, Lincoln's reading interest took him to the greatest of the American fathers, George Washington. As a young boy, Lincoln read Mason Locke Weems' Life of George Washington, published in 1800. Here, Lincoln confronted a Washington who scorned the corrupting effects of ingratitude. And Weems was all too confident in explaining the consequence of ingratitude, which he understood, or at least believed, evoked the divine punishments once wrought against what Weems called ungrateful Israel. Washington himself considered Americans, quote, the sole lords and proprietors of a vast divine offering, for which we shall find the greatest possible reason for gratitude and rejoicing. To a young Lincoln, then, Weems introduced Washington, quote, as a true teacher sent from God to explain the purpose of union. After all, somebody had to. Washington's political faith held that a free people were actually capable of practicing self-government. It was this capability that Weems defined as the first birth of true religion, the spring of political life, and bond of perfection. And if we ruminate on Weems's use of first birth of true religion, it's almost as if somebody may come along in the decades hence and call not for a first birth, but a new birth. As a public figure, when Lincoln advocated gratitude to our fathers, all throughout his public life, he commemorated the sacrifice of those who conceived and dedicated the Republic. As he concluded most famously at Gettysburg in November 1863, the living must transmit the faith of the dead to take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. The American Union was worth preserving, at least as Lincoln considered. It was worth preserving so that the succeeding millions of free, happy people the world over shall rise up and call us blessed to the latest generations. For Lincoln, the fathers once envisioned the potential of their progeny to complete their unfinished work. This familial bond could not be severed. As Lincoln reflected in 1858, we find a race of men living in that day whom we claim as our fathers and grandfathers. This was a national bloodline not restricted by race or ethnicity, by the privilege of birth, religion, or wealth. No, rather the Declaration's pledge of liberty to all provided an inheritance for the entire human family. Such was what Lincoln called the father of all moral principle, the principle that permitted all humans to claim it, as though they were blood of the blood, flesh of the flesh, of the men who wrote that declaration. And so they are. Lincoln also routinely connected the Father's devotion to that of the Supreme Father. In 1858, he quoted the Gospel of Matthew. As your Father in heaven is perfect, be ye also perfect. Lincoln interpreted this as Jesus, quote, having set up that standard, and he who did most toward reaching that standard attained the highest degree of moral perfection. Now, to be sure, no human is flawless, but Lincoln believed that all possessed a moral conscience. All can know the truth. All can offer gratitude for redemption, an undeserved blessing bestowed only by a devoted father. And so here Lincoln connected the religious to the secular. Thus, the American fathers did not establish an ordinary nation. Theirs was a civic liberation of the individual. Theirs was a founding of a nation that asked something better of its citizens, something that compelled humble faith in the truth that all humans are created equal. Like Jesus' standard, the fathers, quote, set up a standard maxim for free society. A maxim which could be familiar to all, revered by all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, thereby spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere. That's in Lincoln's June 1857 retort to the infamous Dred Scott decision. When confronting the adverse political currents of his era, Lincoln encouraged gratitude to the fathers, and yet, as an aspiring politician, he saw, at least in his mind's eye, the vice of ingratitude, tainting contemporaries as diverse as the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, the ambitious Senator Stephen Arnold Douglas, and the slave-holding apologist John C. Calhoun. In their own ways, all three very different individuals, in Lincoln's mind, all three had somehow abandoned the logic of the Declaration and the constitutional order to gratify their own political self-aggrandizement. Garrison outright rejected the Constitution as a satanic covenant with slavery. Douglass alleged that the American founding authored a white majoritarian democracy devoid of any moral core. And Calhoun claimed the divine right of white supremacy to sanction black bondage. Taken together, all three promoted the oldest forms of tyranny. In Garrison, the elimination of political equality and public debate. In Douglass, brash nationalism drawn from populist majorities. And in Calhoun, nihilistic racial dogmas. Lincoln is not the only person, to be sure, in the mid-19th century, unsettled by the misappropriation of gratitude. Black Americans especially leveled just critiques against the ambivalent and often contemptuous ways that some whites abused gratitude to justify racial oppression in the name of national progress. I will introduce you to two examples. The first is this woman, Charlotte Forten, an abolitionist educator and writer, and free black woman born in Massachusetts. Forten trained her lens, her writer's lens, less against slaveholders and more on the ambivalence of white Northerners and even abolitionists who routinely commemorated their national fortune without ever fully fulfilling the necessary attributes imposed by gratitude. On July 4th, 1855, Forten confided, quote, "The patriots, poor fools, were celebrating the anniversary of their vaunted independence, but oh, strange, that they cannot feel their own degradation, the weight of the chains which they have imposed on themselves." Here, Forten critiqued the ways that gratitude can cloud moral judgment, can obscure the obligations that one with good fortune has toward their fellow humans. Now, Forten expressed the exact same sentiments voiced several years earlier in another 4th of July oration delivered by the famous black abolitionist Frederick Douglass. His grand speech on July 5th, 1852, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," is a renowned speech. But seldom do readers fully grasp the depth of Douglass's message. It's predominantly a speech about the misappropriation of gratitude. Douglass did not critique white Northerners and Southerners for their ingratitude. Right? No one walks around saying, "Oh my goodness, I'm so thankful to be unthankful." No one does that. He didn't critique ingratitude. That would be much too easy. On the one hand, Douglass said, "The distance between this platform and the slave plantation from which I escaped is considerable, and the difficulties to be overcome in getting from the latter to the former are by no means slight. That I am here today is to me a matter of astonishment as well as of gratitude." Douglass long expressed gratitude for the freedom to claim his own moral conscience, to own his personal self, to embody that sentiment in the Declaration open to all people. But on the other hand, Douglass excoriated his white audience, an audience comprised largely of abolitionists in Rochester, New York, to whom he said, "Pride and patriotism, not less than gratitude, prompt you to celebrate and to hold it, the founding, in perpetual remembrance. I have said that the Declaration of Independence is the ring bolt to the chain of your nation's destiny, and so indeed I regard it. The principles contained in that instrument are saving principles. Stand by those principles. Be true to them on all occasions, in all places, against all foes, at whatever cost." But in Douglass's rendering, white Americans had not held true to the spirit of '76, to the very principles for which they should have been most grateful. their immediate gratification, even those of the abolitionists, translated into passive complacency. The obsession with national prosperity coming at the expense of the greatest gift of all, human liberty and flourishing. So I talk about Fortin and Douglas here, because in many respects, Fortin and Douglas politically are so different in their seeming radicalism to the political moderation of Lincoln. And yet, when we look at the mid-19th century as a crisis of gratitude, we see Fortin, Douglas, and Lincoln far more alike than they are different. Indeed, all three, united in their understanding of gratitude in ways that clinical psychologists today have only recently studied in the last 2 decades. And that is that the societal and even moral ramifications of inverting gratitude to gratify oneself has immense social implications. In the mid-19th century, we see, through manifest destiny, the rise of a massive modern slave power, that gratitude had become more about personal and national fulfillment and less about public action, more about performance than restraint, more about self-congratulation than repentance or reform. In their own ways, Fortin, Douglas, Lincoln were all saying that American gratitude suppressed national shame. It reinforced imbalances of power. It fomented avoidance of responsibility. It fueled a cultural expectation that those deprived of good fortune should nonetheless exhibit deference to their social betters. It is all of this right here that informs Lincoln's narrative of national ingratitude, a narrative that he told during the 1850s and 60s. Throughout the 1850s, Lincoln crafted this public narrative about the American Union. In his telling, the founding of a natural rights republic was hardly inevitable. The American Revolution could have been yet another simple, ordinary separatist movement to gratify the political grievances outlined in the Declaration of Independence, and yet in 1859, quote, "All honor to Jefferson," Lincoln retorted, who in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national independence had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce into a merely revolutionary document an abstract truth applicable to all men and all times. The fathers had considered their progeny when they considered themselves. In abolishing the relics of monarchy and aristocratic largesse, the individual enjoyed the hope of political equality. Lincoln's plot continued. Despite their father's original trust, future generations had wandered astray. Seduced by riches and power, the succeeding generations scorned their fathers. They pronounced that humans were not all equal, that government was not bound by the rule of law, that some were born to reign and others born to rule. Take, for instance, Stephen A. Douglas, Lincoln's chief political opponent during the 1850s. For Douglas, Americans in the 1850s were obliged only to uphold an amoral republic, quote, "divided into free and slave states just as our fathers made it." For Douglas, the issue of slavery was little more than a national nuisance that could be dispensed with by a simple up or down vote. But that's the great principle of self-government, Douglas said, and we stand by that principle, as we have done, and if we continue to do so, we will increase in wealth and population and power and all the elements of greatness until we shall be the admiration and terror of the world. In Lincoln's narrative, there's other forms of scorn for the fathers. Take, for instance, the Virginian, powerful Senator Robert M.T. Hunter, who in 1860 favored secession. Why? Quote, "We do not stand where we stood anciently. We do not stand where our fathers stood upon this slavery question. Likewise, the upstart Confederacy's new vice president, Alexander H. Stephens, he agreed. He admitted that Jefferson and the fathers had once believed, quote, that the enslavement of the African violated natural law and was wrong in principle. But for Stephens, society had progressed rapidly since the quaint days of '76. It can now be displaced. A deceitful cornerstone ballasted the Confederacy. Hunter and Stephens likened human societies to living organisms that evolve ever new mores to satisfy immediate desires. Traditions and institutions are expendable. Objectivity and ethics are muted. Now please understand, Lincoln never insisted that a citizenry must adhere with blind obedience, quote, in whatever our fathers did. To do so would be to discard all the lights of current experience, to reject all progress and improvement. And yet in Lincoln's story, he warned that the generations must take care when modifying the opinions and policy of our fathers, especially when they understood the question better than we. Now, the turning point in Lincoln's narrative came during the secession crisis of 1861. Here was a moment where an electoral minority hijacked politics to serve its regional jealousies and racial castes. The Republic of the Fathers was now in unprecedented jeopardy. The Fathers had once founded a nation whose principles and political process, Lincoln believed, worked toward the ultimate extinction of slavery, but now, Lincoln recounted, for the first time in the world, an attempt has been made to construct a new nation upon the basis of, and with the primary and fundamental object to maintain and enlarge and perpetuate human slavery. The Confederacy intended to dismantle the Fathers' Republic, shepherding a new age of elite privilege and generational bondage. For decades, Americans had warred against their fathers, and now they confronted the violent angst spawned by their own sneering ambivalence. That which was once self-evident was now little more than a proposition. All citizens, Lincoln said, all citizens were complicit in their nation's crisis, and all had a share in restoring the faith of their fathers. Indeed, Lincoln indicted himself and generations of Americans for their cavalier arrogance. We have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our own hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own, the president lamented in March 1863 when appealing for a national fast day. It behooves us then to humble ourselves, to confess our national sins, and to pray for clemency and forgiveness. Lincoln read the American Civil War as a just chastisement for the nation's ingratitude. Ingratitude breeds fracture, fracture breeds disunity, disunity fires obscene convictions that one's political opponents are malevolent or that democratic institutions impede the will to power. Disunity metastasizes a cancerous moral relativism that rejects the ancient faith in natural human equality. When a free people discard the moral order Lincoln believed, they dismantle the guardrails against human passion and bend toward nihilistic ruin. This is why Lincoln routinely applauded the full measure of gratitude exhibited by millions of young loyal men who soldiered in the Union's defense. As he told a regiment of Ohioans on their way home, "We are all striving to maintain the government and institutions of our fathers, to enjoy them ourselves and to transmit them to our children and our children's children forever. Gratitude requires repentance in acknowledging one's errant path. A delinquent national people, Lincoln believed, must confess, quote, their perverseness and disobedience. They must commit to a new birth of freedom. A new birth of freedom, or a baptism within the spirit of our fathers, who once conceived a nation in liberty and equality. Verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. So spoke the Son of the Heavenly Father. So too at Gettysburg, the American father spoke to his flock. Perhaps freedom comes from the divine, animating the human spirit. The American founding has never fully realized its loftiest ideals. But do its shortcomings negate its highest aspirations? Have not political equality, individual liberty, and the rule of law unleashed a cosmic vista of human flourishing? Perhaps the Republic functions best when we believe in its intrinsic purpose. Perhaps we might abide the advice of a 23-year-old Lincoln who advocated that all citizens read, quote, the histories of their own and other countries, by which they may duly appreciate the value of our free institutions. Then, perhaps, we will again find our better angels in a union of, by, and for the people. Thank you.
Question?
You mentioned the 1830s, and you said something about disregard for the law, and then you said 1838, it's either gratitude or reject the founding fathers. I'm not very familiar with 1838, I was wondering if you could explain that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Lincoln is speaking in January 1838 at the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield, Illinois, amid a decade of mob violence, hangings. He even cites in his speech the burning alive of a free black man in St. Louis. All of this lawlessness, there's conspiracies, that there's slave uprisings, and thus enslaved people are murdered. What his point is that during the 1830s, this cultural lawlessness, cultural mob rule, cultural chaos is the product of rejecting law, procedure, and civil society in favor of the citizens themselves taking law into their own hands. He's not the only one talking about this. This is all through the papers. There's even there's several great artist renderings of the implications of this. Thomas Cole's The Course of Empire, a 5-series painting, he's part of the Hudson School, depicts the implications of this. What Lincoln is saying is that we have a process before us to deal with societal problems. We have rejected law, we've rejected procedure in favor of our own passions. To do so, to reject the law, Lincoln says, will inspire the populace to call for a strong man to restore order. And when that happens, the promise and capability of a free people to govern themselves will evaporate. And Lincoln cites the examples of Caesar, Alexander, and Napoleon to make his point.
So it was the speech he was giving in 1838, not anything that went on beyond his speech in 1838? I mean, was there a debate about that, or?
It's not a debate more so than it is what we would call a national conversation.
And was Andrew Jackson, when was he?
Yeah, this is very much within the broader veil of the Jacksonian moment. Lincoln, of course, a young emergent Whig, is very concerned with the passion of Jacksonian democracy, the rising populist angst of common citizens, and he's rejecting that. He's also responding to the recent president, Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren, whose inaugural address talks quite explicitly about severing a tie with the founding. Van Buren says, you know, we live in this age in which we have now comfortably evolved from 1787, and now we can make decisions that speak to our own specific moment, because we understand the situation better than our fathers did. And I think that Lincoln's really wrapped up into that application.
Who was president in 1830? I have no idea.
Van Buren.
Oh, Van Buren.
Yeah.
And was that his first term?
First, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
I believe that from the very first secessions, Lincoln's position was that secession would not be permitted and would be prevented by military force. How did he intellectually rationalize that position with basic notions of freedom? And did he formulate that view at the time of secession, or was it formed much earlier? But how did he rationalize that?
Yeah, this is a great question. The answer is both. His response to secession was formed much earlier than the secession crisis. When the secession crisis unfolds, he implements his philosophy about organic nationhood, the legitimacy of political majorities, and the protection of political minorities in this way. In his first inaugural address, March 4th, 1861, he calls secession the essence of anarchy. Why? Because the secessionists had rejected the outcome of a free, fair, and open election. And in so doing, they are severing the political order to gratify their immediate self-interest. To which Lincoln says, this is illegitimate because we have a process in which political minorities enjoy constitutional protection, the rule of law, and also the opportunity to redress their grievances, right? You don't like the outcome of an election? Build a majority coalition. Politics is hard work, right? Just because you don't get your way doesn't mean that you get to blow up the whole system. And if you do, that means that people are fundamentally incapable of governing themselves. Because what's probably going to happen if secession is legitimated? What's going to happen the next time if there's an election? There's going to be a winner, there's going to be a loser. Well, if my side's the loser, then I'm going to say, no, that election's illegitimate. And this spawns and metastasizes and grows. Lincoln believes the natural right to revolution is permissible only when an aggrieved party does not have a legitimate legal political mode of recourse, right? This is his logic for the legitimacy of 1776, but the illegitimacy of 1861.
First of all, thank you for that lecture, because I've never really thought about gratitude and ingratitude as a major theme in Lincoln's writings and speeches, and certainly I thought made a very persuasive case for that, and also humility, which is, I think, a very closely related concept. The one thing that surprised me, though, I don't, unless I missed it, I don't think you referred to at all to the last paragraph of the second inaugural address, which I think is possibly the greatest prose paragraph that's ever been written.
Mm-hmm.
And I write in thinking that paragraph is infused with these themes, with charity for all, with malice toward none, with charity for all. Possibly my favorite phrase clause in Lincoln, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to know the right, which seems to me such a marvelous formulation of the need for humility together with a firmness, and they seem very much in tension, and so on. Do you have any thoughts about that paragraph?
Oh, absolutely. I didn't delve into it because that's a lecture unto itself. And this is, as historians and writers love to say, it's in the broader project, right? So yes, I love it too, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives the ability to see the right, right? That last paragraph is coming after the massive previous paragraph, which is an Old Testament Jeremiah, in which God's judgment and punishment is just. But in the Old Testament version, there's also, in Lincoln's mind, the New Testament version, in which God forgives, right? A God who has righteous passion and righteous judgment behind his actions also has the ability for eternal salvation. And in that last paragraph, Lincoln is saying that we should take solace and hope and gratitude that we have forgiveness, and thus we, in our own much smaller way, should extend that same charity to those who have affronted us, right? Especially since the whole second inaugural is all about the just punishment meted out to all Americans, not just slaveholders, to all Americans. And thus, the basis of Lincoln's policy of restoration, policy of reconstruction, which of course ends on April 14th, 1865.
If I understood you correctly, it seems like the philosophy of gratitude seems to have, to be rooted in Neoplatonic ideals versus moral relativism.
Yeah.
Was that kind of the zeitgeist of the time?
That's a really good question. I think for Lincoln, that's the true meaning. I think what he's confronting is a very real human trait. And that is to exhibit gratitude, to say, oh, I'm so thankful for this, but because of my liberty, because of my freedom, I don't have to think beyond myself, right? And I think what Lincoln is trying to say is that yes, we do live in an age of profound national abundance, economic prosperity, but that does not impose upon us a blindness. Right, this is Frederick Douglass's point. With freedom, even a liminal freedom, comes the obligation to continue acting, to harness one's freedom in political agency, to use one's freedom to advocate for political reform, to advocate for the purpose of the system to effect gradual social and political change. And that's the hard part, right? Our system asks something of us all. Right? On the one hand, we are free, but with freedom, it's the old phrase, comes responsibility, the hard work of politics. So it's a reciprocal obligation, right? In a free society, we all, ideally, hopefully, have good fortune. But that fortune comes with a duty. So, a more direct answer to your question, I am still working through. I've only dealt with the Lincoln part of this, because that's the main subject, but I also know that I have to and I want to frame this within a much broader context of what 19th century Americans thought about gratitude and applied it. And I've got a whole list of things on that. I can tell you, Lincoln's understanding of gratitude comes in part from two sources in the mid-19th century, from two prominent mid-19th century Unitarian ministers, William Ellery Channing and Theodore Parker, both of whom, in their own ways, talked about the religious dimensions of the house divided. A house divided against itself cannot stand. It's not merely one side of the nation believes this, the other side of the nation believes this. No. In Matthew 25:11, I think, where Jesus talks about the house divided against itself cannot stand, he's talking about moral relativism. He's talking about looking at the objective truth right in front of you, speaking to the Pharisees, and saying, no, this did not happen, right? Jesus says, the kingdom of God has come. You're looking at it. And the Pharisees say, no. That's the house divided, right? And so Lincoln is reading Theodore Parker and William Ellery Channing talking about the house divided, and he's translating it into a civics lesson, right? And he's saying that in order to be a grateful people is to recognize the objective moral truth of the Republic. In other words, the Republic of Liberty has come. You're looking at it. And if that's true, you can't then read the Declaration of Independence and say, well, only this group is equal, only that group is equal, only this subset deserves political agency. You can't do that, right? This creates the moral crisis. So you have to take that for which we are most grateful and most celebratory and apply it the right way. And there's a process, right? There's a relationship between the Declaration and the Constitution. The Declaration is the ideal, the Constitution is the mechanism, the pathway. It takes a long time, but it's there.
I'm thinking about this, the topic of gratitude in a political context like we're talking about. That would find expression, I think, especially in epidemic rhetoric, in ceremonial, celebratory occasions, and so on. And I'm reminded of Webster's 1820 speech celebrating the 200th anniversary of the landing of the Pilgrims, and that seems to be very much in the spirit of what you're finding in Lincoln in terms of what the role of a certain gratitude for what has been achieved and handed down, the obligations of maintaining and enhancing what has come down in that way. A kind of gratitude which is not just a passive sentiment, but which directs towards future action. And what I'd like to ask you about, which I don't know, is was Lincoln familiar with Webster's speech? Was he influenced by it? What is the relationship of his thinking about rhetoric and knowledge of it and so on to rhetoric? I know he studied Henry Clay a lot, but I don't know about any relation with Webster.
Certainly a devotee of Webster. Lincoln has 4 sources that he uses to write the first inaugural. Henry Clay's speech on the Compromise of 1850, Andrew Jackson's speech against nullification in 1830, the U.S. Constitution, and Daniel Webster's second reply to Robert Hayne from the 1830s. Now, the specific speech that you're referring to, I don't know if Lincoln read it and to what extent he was inspired by it. Lincoln reads Webster as one of the consummate defenders of the federal union, to be sure. But one of the things I want to do with this is show how Lincoln and Webster actually thought differently about the past in this sense. Webster is part of this prominent group of Americans, these romantic nationalists. You can group Edward Everett, the great statesman in order from Massachusetts. You can put George Bancroft, the great 19th century historian, in this category alongside with Webster. And they all look in their own ways at the arrival of the Pilgrims in 1620 and say that's the inevitable moment when freedom is planted in a virgin, unpopulated American soil, and from there it just grows exponentially. In another speech, Webster says that freedom is implanted in the soil, it is unmovable in our mountains. Okay? And this is a subtle but terribly important difference between the way Webster and Lincoln thinks about the nation's origins and its destiny. To put it simply, Lincoln rejects the idea of inevitable destiny, right? Each generation is required to go back, to learn, to recommit, and to transmit. It's not that Webster didn't believe that, to be sure, but it's much more of a simplistic proposition with Webster, Everett, Bancroft. In Bancroft's writings, his 10-volume history of the United States, he has this great passage, this great image, in which he says that God had handpicked the most freedom-loving, I think that's his phrase, the most freedom-loving people from Europe, and plucked them up and moved them metaphysically, right, to the New World. And from there, it's just this inevitable growth. Well, if that's true, think about all the things that you can justify in the name of freedom's inevitable growth. This is how you get Stephen Douglas, right? If freedom is inevitable, then let's just get rid of these annoying things like the national crisis over slavery. Let's just dispense with it. Because our destiny, in other words, is manifest. I'll leave it at that.
Since Lincoln was well informed and so much of his ideas came from the Bible, did he ever speak of slavery in terms of the violation of God's commandments? Thou shalt not steal, being ultimately the commandment thou shalt not steal applies to not stealing human beings.
Absolutely.
And bearing false witness, in effect saying people are subhuman and not taking God's name in vain by saying God has given us, like Calhoun, would be a certain supremacy. So does he mention that? Because I haven't heard that.
All the time. I'll give you 2 examples, just for the sake of time. In his first major anti-slavery speech in October 1854, it's the longest speech of his career, on the repeal of the Missouri Compromise at Peoria, Illinois. If you just Google Lincoln and Peoria address, it'll come up. In one part of the speech, and this is in opposition to Douglas's repeal of the Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and popular sovereignty, where we in this room, as a simple majority, just vote up or down on whether we're going to have slavery or not. And that's just riddled with moral consequences. So much so that Lincoln paraphrases from the New Testament and says, you cannot serve God and mammon, right? Mammon being being seduced by riches and power on the one hand, and God on the other. If you claim to be an adherent to the Declaration of Independence, you cannot be so obsessed with national power, national aggrandizement, national prosperity, so much so that you just vote up or down on whether to enslave another person without his consent. That metaphor, that allegory is all throughout his 1850s writings. Check out the End of the Dred Scott speech too, because he doubles down on that as well, June of 1857. Second example was one that you mentioned about man stealing, right? In February of 1862, Lincoln sentences for execution a man by the name of Nathaniel Gordon, who was a notorious slave trader, I think from Connecticut, either Connecticut or New York, I can't recall. The point is, he's a northerner, right? And the United States had technically outlawed the transatlantic slave trade in 1807, but the law had constantly been violated all throughout the 19th century. But one of the most notorious cases is Nathaniel Gordon, who trafficked about 900 captives from the west coast of Africa illegally, the majority of whom were children. And the reason for that, in Gordon's mind, was that children are much less likely to engage in slave insurrection. Well, he's captured and then sentenced to execution. And Lincoln at first stays the execution for the purpose, I'm going to paraphrase, so that basically Gordon can come right with God on the basis that he engaged in man stealing. And that's, I can't remember the book specifically from Exodus that talks about this, but the stay of the execution for Nathaniel Gordon is right out of Lincoln's reading of Exodus. And the execution is stayed so that Gordon can contemplate his violation of God's law, and then he's executed. There's many more that I could give you, but that's two.
Because do you think it's been buried, this knowledge about Lincoln? Because, we're not allowed to talk God anymore. So would that have, in effect, cancel Lincoln's godly perspectives?
That's a good question. I would say no. One of the best books, Lincoln and religion books are a dime a dozen. The best one I would argue is the great Lincoln scholar Allen Guelzo. His book is called Abraham Lincoln, Redeemer President. And it's a biography through Lincoln as a religious thinker and practitioner. Yeah.
You mentioned during the time, it was a diverse polity. Could you define what you mean by diverse
Yeah,
polity?
yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. We tend to think of the 19th century as this very static white versus black, and that's not incorrect. But I mean, think of the founding. The entire purpose of the Constitutional Convention is to figure out some way to bind together these very different, very diverse 13 American states that in no way look alike, think alike, pray alike, practice economics alike. Quakers, Baptists, Catholics, to a lesser extent, Jews. By the mid-19th century, Irish, Germans, to say nothing of, I can't even think of the other faiths, but you know, how do you bind a republic? How do you bind a union that in no way looks or thinks in any way alike? And I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that our society is far more diverse today, rightly so. And our society is diverse because the system allows it to be. I personally am grateful that we can work out our unbelievably unique, diverse approaches to these problems without resorting to violence. There have been issues, I know. We're talking about one of the greatest issues in crises. But what if those are exceptions to the rule? And what if the system allows us a space to debate, to argue, in spite of our differences? No one person in this room thinks alike. No one person in this room has a similar background. That's good, right? But the system of unity, properly understood, allows us right here to hash it out and to forge some kind of simple common consensus based on very simple but unchanging principles.
So the diversity is more religious and maybe Western European diversity?
Yeah, and I would say economic. I would to an extent say political. Yeah.
Okay, let's all thank Andrew and I mean, I don't think, I didn't plan it this way, and I don't think you did, but couldn't have had a better time of year to be doing this lecture.
Well, I'm glad you think so, because I was nervous about that. But, you mean the Thanksgiving?
Yeah.
Yes, no, of course, it is the month of gratitude, indeed, yes. I thought you were talking about the election.
No.